We only find them when they're dead. No, I need to be more dramatic than that with this kind of title. We only find them when they're dead. Dun dun dun. Hello and welcome to Looking for the Best, a comic quest. My name is Danny, and on this show I search for the best of the best comics, graphic novels, webtoons, and more. And I ask the very important question, can I fill my shelves with greatness? On today's episode, we will be discussing a sci-fi indie comic from Boom Studios called We Only Find Them When They're Dead. The first issue was released in September 2020, but I'll be talking about Volume 1, which collects the first 5 issues in the series and was released about half a year later in May of 2021, so it's a little more recent. I have both the individual issues and the trade paperbacks because your girl is an overachiever and I collect too much stuff. And as of this recording, the comic is still being released, more for me to collect. 3 volumes have been confirmed with 5 issues apiece, so 15 issues total. I have no idea if the series will end after those volumes are done, or if it will continue on in some other fashion that they've yet to confirm, but Boom has said that this will be the final arc, but that doesn't necessarily mean the entire universe will never be returned to again, but I guess I'll just have to wait and see. So we're here to talk about Volume 1. This is a high-concept, big-idea sci-fi story set in the future in outer space. The main parts of the story take place in the year 2367, so a little ways away. And yep, there are spaceships and fancy futuristic technology, but sometimes it even feels a little bit more like a mystery genre story instead, what with how much unknown information there is, which you can probably infer from the title alone. But I mean, I love the name of this book. We only find them when they're dead. Doesn't that sound fascinating? This title is just so intriguing to me because it poses a lot of questions. Who is we? Who are they finding? Or what are they finding? And why are they dead? In my opinion, this title seems like a reflection of modern culture in a way, right? It reminds me of clickbait articles or compelling YouTube video titles. It has that intrigue, that thing that makes me want to click, or in this case, pick it up and read it. And it might be internet content, a published novel, a comic book series, whatever it is. Captivating titles can really go a long way. And this is nothing new for the publishing industry, but still, it seemed like something that's very relevant and very now. I was a little wary at first, though, when I read this particular title. We only find them when they're dead. I don't like a lot of gore. It's one thing to read about violence and carnage as words on a page, and it's another to literally see a drawing with blood and guts and nasty stuff. Yuck. So the word dead had me a little concerned. Is all we're gonna see dead bodies and stuff? Because I don't really want to do that. No thank you. Dead bodies on every page? That sounds pretty awful. Thanks, but no thanks. But don't you worry, everyone. I wouldn't have picked it if that were the case. Because I am too easily icked. Not only would a really gross book not be on my shelf, but I probably wouldn't have even read past the first few pages if it was clearly just a vehicle for gore and death. I mean, wait, it is a little bit about death, and there is sort of a little bit of gore, but it's really not nearly as gruesome as I thought it would be. And this is due to both the story itself and the art style that they chose, which is very stylistic. But hold on, let me back up. I gotta answer the first few questions that this title poses because I bet you might be curious about them, right? And I do know a few of the answers. So, the we of We Only Find Them When They're Dead is primarily about a group of 4 people who pilot an autopsy ship. And they aren't the only ones doing the finding of the dead, but they are some of the main characters of this particular story, at least in Volume 1. The them are gigantic bodies floating out in space that are, you guessed it, dead. The characters refer to these humongous beings as gods. Gods in air quotes that you can't see right now. Gods, quotes. But whether they are actually gods is up for debate because they aren't alive anymore and they don't exhibit any godly powers. They're just mostly massive. and their origins are unknown, and the characters have no clue why they just appear in space sometimes, which is probably why they lean towards more of a theological explanation. So, what to do with these giant dead bodies that just show up already dead? Why, harvest them, of course. Ew. But I guess the other options are to leave them to float in space, where they can just drift around like pool toys or something. Oh god, what a visual. Okay, well, they could destroy them, but they're so large, that would be really hard. Can't exactly pick up the Eiffel Tower and put it into an Eiffel Tower-sized incinerator, can you? Not unless you build that incinerator first, which is not easy, and it would take a lot of manpower to shove the Eiffel Tower in there. This is a bad analogy, but I'm just trying to demonstrate for size here. Or maybe they could find some other use for them that would probably also be kind of morbid and creepy, like turning them into a giant amusement park or something. Slight foreshadowing for Volume 2. It's not an amusement park, but they do something different. I'm not telling any more than that. Alright, well, they have a lot of harvestable materials, so the government said one day, hey, let's pick them apart for supplies and regulate it, because we're the government and we control things. Yay, government! Anyway, this Reaper crew, if you will, is one of many ships that shows up whenever a body appears, and they gather materials like meat and metals. And then they sell whatever they've gathered for money. Capitalism! I'm so enthusiastic in this episode, aren't I? But the crew, let's get back to them. There are 4 main characters that collectively control this autopsy ship called the Vihan 2, which is a spaceship with the tools to cut open a giant dead body, an autopsy ship. So, like a normal spaceship, but then they attached oversized laser scalpels, big grabby things, and a handful of drones, and it also has lots of storage space, for the stuff that they're collecting. And because the bodies they find are so large compared to these normal-sized people who are the main characters, there are many ships that go to collect the different resources. Can't fit a whole giant into one tiny ship. And like your average bickering siblings, they get into disagreements over what's considered the best parts, which are areas like the heart and the eyes. Bleh, but they're just gonna fight because, no, it's mine. I got here first. I wanted it. This is usually for me, so it's mine. Argue, argue, argue. And in the first issue, the Vihan 2 is responsible for taking a portion of the upper lip off of the giant body, and you do see them cutting into it, and there is some flesh and a little bit of gross, but no, hear me out though, I swear, okay, look, I know this sounds really gross, I do, but it's actually not that bad. Yes, there are some ick moments, but I have seen some bloody comics before, I shudder at the thought, and truly this is a lot easier to get through. It's not that bad, I swear. This is not Grey's Anatomy, there are no huge surgeries, or people getting down in communal spaces, which is a different kind of ew. Anyway, the crew of 4, they are captained by George Malek and his 3 subordinate crew members, Ella Hauer, the coroner, her brother Jason Hauer, the engineer, and Alice Wirth, the quartermaster. They all work together to collect resources from the bodies in their little autopsy ship. Alongside these autopsy harvesting collectioning ships are government police of some kind in their own police ships, instead of cars, that are responsible for keeping the peace, making sure no one does anything illegal, like steal extra goods, body parts, that they don't report or aren't allowed to take, and to prevent people from getting into real big fights with one another. Here's a great blurb from the trade paperback copy of the comic that I think does a great job summing this all up. And I quote, "While other autopsy ships race to salvage the meat, minerals, and metals that sustain the human race, Malek sees an opportunity to finally break free from this system by being the first to find a living god. But Malek's obsession with the gods will push his crew into danger at the darkest reaches of space, unless the rogue agent on their trail can stop them first." Gasp! Drama, intrigue, great summary overall. So, the gods are dead. This is a fact. They only find them when they're dead. Another fact. And different ships fight over the corpses. But what if they didn't? What if Captain Malek can find one that's alive? That is Malek's ultimate quest, his life's mission. He doesn't just want to find them when they're dead, he believes there's more going on and he wants answers. But of course, no quest can be easy. There needs to be obstacles and challenges, such as the rogue agent on their trail, if you recall. And this agent is really the final of the main characters in Volume 1, at least of the most important ones, and her name is Paula Richard. She has a connection to Malek from before the beginning of the story, which they do dive into later, though not necessarily in the clearest of fashions, but we also meet some of his other family members and people from their collective past. Now you may be wondering, Danny, why are you bothering to tell us all of these character names? We aren't going to remember them all, and nobody really takes notes during a podcast. Look, I have a reason. I promise. While writing this episode and getting all of my info together, I made a bit of a discovery. And I was feeling very smart about it because I haven't seen it mentioned much online, though I'm sure I'm not the first person to actually notice it. Just, let me have this. I was smart for a minute here. So, I thought George Malek was an interesting choice for a name. George, I keep saying it like this because it's spelled Georges, ends in an S. For whatever reason, my first instinct when I read this was to call him Jorge, but then I looked it up and it's a French name that I'll probably never pronounce exactly right. They say it's not a hard G, it's a zh kind of George. But English speakers like myself would normally just say George instead. Anyway, while looking his name up, I had a thought. I wonder what his name means. And then another thought. I wonder what all of their names mean. And would you look at that, the names have very intentional meanings behind them, sometimes even very literal, coinciding with their job or title. I have no doubt that they were chosen by the author on purpose with intention. So first up, George Malek. His name essentially means Farmer King. He is the leader of a group that farms dead bodies, so that works pretty well. And the King stuff is also a hint of what's to come in Volume 2, but I won't spoil that for you. Next, Ella Hauer. She is the coroner. The first name Ella can mean female or goddess, and Hauer can mean butcher or cutter. Literally, the first action you see her do as the coroner is cut a portion of the face off of the giant dead body with her giant laser scalpel, so she's a lady butcher. Her brother is Jason Hauer, which means healer butcher. As the engineer, you might say he's more of a literal fixer than a healer, but I think this is also a bit of a hint as to what's to come in Volume 2. Ooh, I keep teasing you. You better read the second volume. And last up in the crew is Alice Wirth, and that's Wirth with an I. The internet tells me that her first name means noble and the last name means innkeeper or provider. She is the quartermaster, and in the Navy, a quartermaster can serve as a helmsman, steering and navigating the ship, or they can act as an assistant to the captain or do other related duties. In the military, however, as opposed to the Navy, they are also literally responsible for the quarters or living spaces, quartermaster, which could explain the translation to innkeeper, right? It's more of a literal alternative to the word quartermaster. Now, we can't forget about the woman chasing them, Paula Richard. Her name means small judge, which is just so fitting. She's not necessarily of any high rank, so you could say her position is small, and she does literally judge, police, enforce, and work on behalf of the government. You might also say her judgments are small-minded, but that's up for interpretation. And speaking of, you can also probably find a lot of other less literal and more interpreted meanings with these names, and how the characters behave and develop because of them. But that is a more interesting discussion if you've actually read the book, which I don't want to assume you've done before listening. Anyway, I just thought it was a really fun touch, and clearly a lot of thought was put into these names and to other elements of the book, and it seemed like a fun thing to point out. I was also interested in the names after reading the second volume. Another teaser, because the names are much more obvious and the meanings much more clear in Volume 2. Volume 1 is a little more subtle in that respect. So the concept is cool, the names are cool. What about the art? Well, the most obvious thing that I noticed when I first picked up the book was that this was very clearly drawn digitally. I mean like in Procreate or Illustrator or some other digital illustration app of some kind. It doesn't look old school at all whatsoever, and it's a very modern digital art style, which I actually really enjoyed. Caveat though, I really enjoyed it digitally. Yep, that's right, you heard me, digitally. And who would have thunk that art created digitally looks best in its native form as pixels on a screen? I have both the trade paperback and the individual issues, and let me tell you, at times it is difficult to read the pages from either one. I'm not sure if it's simply and most obviously the style of the art, or if it was the ink that was used, the paper that was chosen, or whatever other decision was made to create this book, but god damn is it reflective and overly dark. It can be very hard to see the details. Like, literally, the ink is darker than the subject matter at times, haha, but jokes. So, I did originally read it as a printed paperback book. But when doing this review, I decided to go back and reread, which I do for note-taking purposes, and I thought, I wonder what it looks like if I were to read it on a tablet. So I signed up for some digital comic services, and I thought, let's take a look. And when I finally tried the digital version, it made a world of a difference, y'all. For real, I compared these side by side, comic next to paperback, next to tablet, and the tablet version is just miles ahead. Without a doubt, I can see so much more on the tablet. There's some really great color blending for panels that include outer space that's just completely hidden by the printed ink and shiny reflective pages. It's truly spectacular art when you look at it in its best form. And this was an interesting lesson to learn as a newer comic reader. I didn't think that I would prefer to read anything on a tablet or some other device, but sometimes it's better that way. And you live and you learn and you try new things, and that's the whole point of this quest. So this comic was drawn digitally, and whether intentional or not, it seems like it was made to be looked at digitally, at least appreciated in its digital form. And maybe most people will disagree with me here, but I think if you truly want to enjoy this comic in its very best form, you should read it on an electronic device. I think it looks so much better. But if you hate reading comics online or on a device, I get it. I understand. You can still read it in a printed book. It's not bad per se to read it that way, but side by side, I think it's just not as good, which is maybe also the case for other stories like this, especially ones with big dark sections of outer space or that were created on some kind of digital illustration software. But regardless as to the medium in which you choose to read it, the art itself is still really stellar, haha, pun fully intended, and it's stylistic, so the blood and body parts that I have repeatedly said aren't that bad, they're not that bad. They are drawn in a less realistic manner. The gore doesn't look as gory, it's stylized. It's like if someone were to make a movie or a video game with a lot of blood and guts and the rating people were like, no, it has to have a mature rating, and the creators were like, no wait, we wanted a teen rating. Then they have to dial it back heavily, put a filter on it, make it more stylized, so that it's just not as gross or explicit. It's rated T for teen. And there's less detail, but more opportunities for different interpretations. I also just want to say that the cutting of the bodies and the gore and stuff is mostly really in the first issue. You rarely see it again after that. It does sort of happen again in issue 4, but the worst of it is in issue 1. If you can get through that, you can get through the rest of it no problem. So I think I've been mostly speaking pretty positively here, but I know I've slid in a few comments now and again about certain things that maybe weren't quite as amazing as I wanted them to be. And, there are some cons, besides the printing, in this book that I'd like to mention because it's certainly not perfect and it doesn't need to be. At times, both the art and the story can be confusing. As the reader, you're dropped into this world, and when you expect world building or character history to be revealed, it isn't always done clearly or even at all. Sometimes they just don't tell you things that seemed kind of important and worth knowing. Yes, they're keeping the mystery alive here, but I don't think that they needed to exclude as much as they did. And in the art, the clarity can be lacking as well. For example, maybe the panels don't show enough of the scene, or they're in a strange order, or they're too busy. So then the action is confusing. It's hard to tell what's going on, and maybe it's also hard to tell who's even talking because the word bubbles aren't obvious or clear enough. And sometimes maybe the character art isn't distinct enough either. I don't know how much I want to be constantly jumping back and forth in the story on different pages and different issues to find the necessary reference points to figure out who's who and what's going on. But, look, they don't need to hold my hand through it, but I think there are still some flaws in the overall design. They also jump around the timeline a lot in the story, from past to present, as they fill in some of the gaps in the information. And the point of the jumping is to flesh out the narrative. I get that, for sure. But one thing I kind of wish they did differently, though, is not just list the year dates, but tell you the time period relative to the present. Let me explain. So, as an example, the story takes place in the year 2367, and there's a scene that says it's from 2323. But instead of saying this is 2323, they could have just said 44 years ago. But, this is just a personal preference, and I can see why they chose not to do it this way. I'm just being a little nitpicky is all. Actually, you could argue that almost every con was an artistic choice that comes down to a matter of preference. Because for every negative, every con, I could just as easily have said they were pros. So, the story is too confusing. Sure, but it also is a much more interesting story because of that. It makes you think, it makes you ask questions, it has you coming back again and again for more answers, more reveals, just more. Okay, but the art is also confusing. Yes, maybe the panel should have been structured differently or some of the characters drawn a little more distinctly, but it's a heavily stylized book, and you have to pay attention when you're reading and actually, read it. But what about when the art is too busy and there's too much going on? Yeah, okay, that's fair. It can be difficult to decipher what's going on when an artist goes overboard. But I personally love when the art really fills out the pages. I was just complaining the other day about a different comic that had really plain backgrounds and it made it look incomplete and boring. I do not want my comics to be boring. Also, just throwing this in once again, this particular story is a lot easier to read on a digital device as opposed to on printed paper. Just throwing that in one more time. Well, the timeline is confusing. Sure is. But it's not supposed to be completely straightforward. This was an intentional choice, and not everyone likes this sort of thing. Again, personal preference. And it kind of reminds me of the Birds of Prey movie, which I know frustrated some people because it was told very out of order, just like many other movies, Memento, and all that kind of stuff. And finally, I won't spoil the ending of Volume 1, but I do know some folks complained about it. And here's my take, though. I really don't think it should be considered an actual ending at all, because I've read the second volume and I know it's not nearly the end. Instead, I suggest treating the final issue of Volume 1 as more of a mid-season finale on a TV show, not an actual full season finale, because there's still so much story to go, and they just broke it up into volumes so that they could sell it to you easier in stages, and not because it actually literally ends at Volume 1. That's not how it works. That's not how many of these comics work, unless there's some kind of limited series that could all fit into one volume. Alright, so we've talked a little bit about the premise, the names, the art, and I could easily keep going for quite a while talking about the different themes and motifs and other noteworthy moments and such. But to save time and be a little bit more concise, I've made a list of 7 things that I wrote down as noteworthy in my personal notes as I was going through the story that I wanted to share. So, here we go. Number 1. In issue 2, there is a very small, 2-page demonstration of a queer relationship. It's almost a blink and you miss it. It was unexpected, in part because of the plot, but I liked that it was included here. And look, I know, there's a larger argument that could be had about whether or not this is just someone checking off a diversity box, but I don't really agree with that sentiment here. But we're not going to go into that today because I've already done enough bouncing back and forth of different perspectives, and we don't need to just have a podcast where I argue with myself the whole time. So, moving on. Number 2. Speaking of interpersonal relationships, there is a lot of arguing in this book. It seems like the characters very rarely agree, and there's just always conflict between them. They're pretty selfish, sometimes have vendettas, and are pretty untrustworthy. Some have loyalty, but some really don't, and I can't say that there are good guys and bad guys. There are really no good guys and bad guys in this story. Instead, I just say there are people with different motives, beliefs, and justifications, and that's that. And this carries over into Volume 2 as well, and I really just would say there isn't much happiness overall in the entirety of this comic. So if you're going in here expecting a happy story or a black and white, no gray area, morals and values kind of story, you're not going to find that here. Number 3. The art really does a good job of emphasizing how massive the gods truly are. The layouts and the way they take up the pages, the color palettes they used, everything about it just reinforces the sheer size of these things. And I think it takes skill to pull that off. I mean, there's this one moment where you see a 2-page spread with a big old god on one side that bleeds over into the other side, and a teeny weeny little spaceship that's going up to this massive creature to, harvest from it. And it's just this weird, size difference that makes you put a lot of this into perspective. And it's just really interesting how it was laid out and drawn and colored and done, and I just really enjoyed it. Number 4, another note on the art. I think that the color theory in here is fabulous, and it's really cool when different colors are assigned to different elements or scenes, giving them their own vibe and also adding a level of separation and distinction. If you do pay attention to the colors, it can help you figure out the stuff that might have actually been confusing before. All right, number 5. In each issue, the writer likes to play around with recurring sentences or phrases, establishing a specific narrative voice. They have a handful of captions that read things like, "The year was 2367, the ship was the Vihan 2, an autopsy ship with a crew of 4. And then later, "The year was X, the ship was Y, and some other sentence here." It's a nice choice. I liked it. I think it gives a lot more personality and weight than the "meanwhile in another city, ... or "later that night, ... captions that you see all over the place. Although SpongeBob sure does nail the meanwhile trope, doesn't it?
Meanwhile.
Number 6. There are many Navy and military references throughout the story. For example, they say 8 bells, all's well, over and over. 8 bells, all's well. 8 bells, what is that referring to? I had to Google this one because I had no idea, and it isn't really explained very well in the story. So, if you didn't already know, here's a fun fact for you. It's a Navy thing that has to do with telling shift times by bells. Every 30 minutes, a bell would be struck, and on the 8th bell, the shift is over and it's the end of watch. It also has connections with death. At some Navy funerals, they strike 8 bells, which is end of watch and end of life. Number 7. Religion is both a small and big part of this story. It's small because in this volume, while they call them gods, they don't treat these bodies with reverence or respect. They don't worship them or anything. The beings aren't gods with titles like God of Death or God of Partying or something like that. And there are no rituals or traditions around them. The people just poach for parts, which isn't really a tradition as much as it is just taking advantage of a dead body that you found and stumbled across. So there is no organized religion, at least no obvious organized religion, but there are religious undertones and many possible religious interpretations behind both the characters and their motivations, as well as just the concept of deities, icons, powerful beings, and how people value them. Captain Malek is a believer. He believes he can find a living God, with few people sharing that belief and no evidence to support it, other than assuming it was alive once and it's dead now, so maybe I can find one that's alive. And he believes he can find this living God, and through this mission, he is searching for meaning and purpose in his life. He seeks enlightenment, answers to the questions, who are these gods and where did they come from? Speaking of, who are the gods and where do they come from? Well, we never get an answer. And as a small spoiler, we don't find out in Volume 2 either. The issues in Volume 3 are still in the process of being released, but they aren't all out yet, so I can't tell you if we find out in any of those as well. And speaking of the volumes, they are split in a very interesting fashion. Issues 1 through 5 make up Volume 1, and it's set in one particular time period. There are flashbacks, of course, but there is a present timeline that we're following, which is Malek's mission to find a living god. That is Volume 1, in the most simple of terms. Issues 6 through 10 make up Volume 2, and there's a significant time jump to the future between issues 5 and 6, so volumes 1 and 2. 50 years have passed, which means a lot of changes to this world and lots of new world building, a new mystery, new characters, and a new goal. And once again, issues 11 to 15, which are volume 3, will have another significant time jump of another 50 years. Now, I don't know if this happens a lot where a story is released in phases like this. I know that time passes in comics, time jumps happen, stories start and stop in different time periods, etc., but I don't know how often a story is all written by one person, has the same small number of issues for each chunk of time, and was intended to be written and released that way from the beginning. It's a really compelling approach that I've enjoyed immensely, as I've said many times about all the other things in this book. But if you've been listening for this long, then you might still be wondering about some of the questions we asked earlier, like, does Captain Malek find a living god or not? Does he get captured by the rogue agent or not? And I could spoil this for you right now, but I won't. Instead, I'll just say that these two particular questions do get answered some way, somehow in Volume 1. Now, as you may have realized, I intentionally didn't go into a lot of the plot here because it's hard to describe in an audio podcast, to be honest, but I did try to point out things that I thought were interesting about the story and maybe would make you want to read it. But I've been talking for long enough, and I think it's about time to wrap things up. All right, now, did I like this book? Heck yes. Is it worth the space on the shelf? Absolutely. I will gladly be owning all of the individual issues and the trade paperback copies. If you're a sci-fi fan, then I do recommend checking it out. I promise, for the 100th time, it is really not as gross as the death title implies. I swear, it's not as ick, it's not that bad, it's stylized. I am giving you my word here. You will see some stuff, but it's not nearly what some other comics that have come out recently have done. And as I said, I've already read Volume 2 and will absolutely be reading Volume 3. Maybe in a future episode we'll talk about them, but they'd probably be a lot more spoiler-heavy than this one. And if my questions aren't all answered in Volume 3, like the origin of the gods, then I really want a prequel series. I want more details as to how we got here, or maybe just a series exclusively about the gods and not about the people who find them when they're dead. What about the before? What about their lives before they are dead? I don't know what's going to happen in Volume 3, but this is my request to the creators and authors and artists of this book, that if you don't answer my questions, then I would like more, please. Just keep going and don't stop. I like this book and I would like to know all of the things. Thank you. You know, there is a lot to play with here, and I think this could become a compelling opportunity for expansion if the creators so choose. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Check out our website, cactuscomics.com, if you're interested in buying the book, because we have some affiliate links on there. And if you use our links, we do make just a little bit of money, and it does support the podcast. You can also support the Cactus Comics Patreon if you want to, but you certainly don't have to, and the podcast is always going to be free. And I thank you for taking the time to listen here with me today and talk about We Only Find Them When They're Dead. Before we go, here's an extra segment that I thought would be fun. Okay, so actually this was going to be an entirely different segment, but it turned out to be boring, so here's this instead. And I'm not sure how interesting it will be, but I wanted to leave you with something, so I've decided to share a few things I recently picked up from the comic book store, because why not? So the first comic I have is the latest issue of Alice Ever After, which is another comic by the same publisher of We Only Find Them When They're Dead, which is Boom Studios. It's an adult Alice in Wonderland adaptation that's pretty dark and deals with addiction and stuff like that. I've only read the first issue so far, but it seems promising, and both the primary and the variant covers are just fantastic, and I particularly love the B cover for issue 1 that was done by Jenny Frison. I'm a big fan of hers, so you should check that out. Also, I picked up the most recent issue of Twig. Now, I'm not really sure why, but Twig has just tons of variant covers, exclusive to a whole bunch of different comic book stores. They're really fantastic, but I cannot afford to collect them all. There's gotta be well over 3 dozen or something like that, at least. And if you like cute creature art, though, both the covers and the story do deliver on that. And if anybody knows why there's so many covers, then please tell me, because I would also love to know. Next is Action Comics, Volume 1, number 789, which is not a recent comic at all. It came out in 2002, and I literally only got this for the joke on the front. The issue seems to be about Crypto, the super dog from Superman, and he's shown standing on top of a wooden doghouse that has a sign that reads, Doghouse of Solitude, which is a reference to Superman's Fortress of Solitude. And I just loved it. I thought the cover was great, and I just took it home because, sometimes you see something and it makes you smile and you go, I'm just going to take that. It's a couple dollars. I'm going to bring it home. That's just for me. Am I going to read it? Probably not, but I love the cover. And in that same vein, I also have Miss Marvel, Volume 4, issues 29 and 30. And these are from 2018 and feature Kamala Khan as Miss Marvel, who is also the star of her own Disney Plus MCU TV show these days. And each of these issues has a pun on the cover. Number 29 says, Con, you feel the love tonight? And number 30 says, it's complicated. Oh, the fun back issues you can find in a comic book store. And last one, She-Hulk Volume 4, Issue 4, but specifically the C cover by Russell Dauterman. He has been doing these really fantastic covers lately where one character is drawn a bunch of times in the same pose, but with a slightly different appearance, and then they're all layered on top of each other. It's a little hard to describe, but it's a neat effect, and it just looks really great. And he's also done it for Avengers Forever, X Lives of Wolverine, and maybe a few more. I also got this comic because I am actually reading it, She-Hulk, and it wasn't just for a fun cover, but that is a bonus. I have yet to read issue 4, I've read 1 through 3, but I've been enjoying it so far, and I'm happy to continue reading, and I'm also very appreciative of the little mini intros they've been putting in the, first page inside the front cover type thing, where they tell you what's been going on so far in case you forgot, and it's very, here's what you missed on Glee, but also very useful, so I'm happy to have it. And it's just been a fun time, and I'm excited for the TV show that I believe is coming out in August, I want to say. I've been enjoying the Miss Marvel show, and She-Hulk show is going to be great. Tatiana Maslany, big fan of hers from Orphan Black. So anyway, been reading that, and that's all I have to share with you for now. Those are all the comics that I thought were interesting enough to mention. Everything else is just kind of we'll get to it another time. But thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Support your friendly local comic book store if you can. And that's all for now. Thanks, and have a good one.